This week on Life and Faith.
I think we have bought a false, devastating myth about national identity being identified with gambling.
One of the most intimate places you can be with someone is at the moment of their death.
This is the only world in which I live. I don't live in another world.
I am autonomous and independent and self-sufficient, and I will get to decide my good.
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart and I'm with Justine Toe. Hey Justine, how you doing?
Hello.
Now, have you ever won, Justine, a raffle or a prize or anything of that nature?
I don't reckon I have, actually.
Really?
My dad used to love a bet, and he would bet on the Melbourne Cup, and then he would just ask me to pick a horse.
You don't remember a great victory in this area?
No, it's not really something that I think or care about. But what about you? Have you won something?
Yeah, I have. I went through this little run of winning things.
Oh.
So I had three kind of raffle-y type things that I won in a row. I was in a triathlon and I won a bike helmet, among all the other races. I then bought a CD and won a surfboard, and I've still got that. And then I bought my wife, Michelle, a top or a dress or something at a store, and they said, you can fill this in and go into this prize competition. I won her a year's worth of clothes. So
Wow.
I can imagine
That's
that was
crazy.
Made me popular.
So are we talking this happened in a matter of months that you won these three things in succession?
Yes. I need to say I haven't won anything since, and this was a long time ago.
Okay, well, let me take you back to that shining time when you were the darling of the universe. Did it make you want to keep trying your luck?
Yes and no. Like, it made me think, it's worth entering these competitions because sometimes you win. Although I have to admit, it didn't translate to me then entering a whole lot of these things. So for some reason, I couldn't quite make that step. But I can see how it could easily, because if you have a little bit of a win, it does make you think, it is possible, and that big prize could be there for me.
Well, I do remember one time my dad was betting on the Melbourne Cup, and he'd already went to the TAB to kind of sort out his bet, and then he drove home, and then something possessed him, and he drove back to the TAB.
To go again. Yeah.
But then when he won, that high that he experienced was significantly enhanced by the fact that he'd gone back and taken an extra punt, if I can put it that way. So I could see the kind of effect that it had on him. And it seems to me that he's not alone, in being really into this. We've got lotteries, lotto, scratchies, horse racing, greyhounds, the trots. What are the trots?
Trotting. So
what is trotting? Don't horses do that?
But they have a carriage thing, and someone sits on the back of this. I'm going to talk as if I know what I'm talking about. This sort of buggy thing.
Right.
And it's like horse riding, but they're limited in what they can only trot. They can't gallop.
Oh my gosh!
So
you haven't seen this? This is all crazy to me. I'm sorry. But of course we've got the casino and pokies. I am more familiar with this sort of thing. It seems that if we can kind of understand what is important, I suppose, to us as a people, the fact that we have so many different avenues open to us to place a bet surely signifies something.
It does, I think. And for me, it does say something powerful about who we are as a people. And we want to sort of look at that today. Even if you're not into betting in any sense, you can't escape it either. I watch a lot of sport, as you know, Justine, and sports betting is so ubiquitous. You just cannot get away from it. You can't watch a game of footy, watch cricket, anything like that without being bombarded with all this betting information. And
are we talking though like integrated into the sports cast that you're watching, or is it in the ads?
Both.
Right.
It's both. Definitely both. So even with a lot of intentionality, you couldn't escape it.
I do remember one time you mentioned that your son Luke, at the time quite young, could tell you the odds or something.
Yeah, there was a bit of we had this famous trip to a grand final, and I was in a car, like a 7-seater car with a bunch of mates who were heading out to this. And I remember one of the guys said, I wonder what the odds are for today, or which team's paying what. And then from the very back of the car, this little 8-year-old squeaks up.
Wow.
Melbourne are paying $1.50 and the Bulldogs are $3.25. And all these guys looked at each other like, what on earth? But this was sort of an indication of how much this affects you. Though. Does it affect kids? Are they hearing this message? Absolutely they are.
Yeah, well, they're soaking it up, really. And they're reflecting back, aren't they? like
Yes.
what they're hearing and learning.
And not
from the
from
world.
me. Like, it's not like I'm into this sort of stuff.
Are you
anyway.
sure? Are you sure, Simon?
But seriously, Justin, what is the impact of all of this? Is it just harmless fun? Does the Australian obsession with gambling suggest anything deeper in terms of our collective psyche and what we think is the shape of the good life? And is it just the killjoy Christians who would even want to talk about this topic?
I think after this year, we have to say, no, it's not just the killjoy Christians. Of course, this year there's been the Victorian Royal Commission into Crown Casino and its suitability to run an operation. And the Royal Commissioner, Ray Finkelstein, delivered the verdict on Crown that it had acted unethically, illegally, exploitatively, and was basically unfit to operate a casino. And yet, he said, they can still operate because they're critical to the economy and it would sink too many small businesses. So you have 2 years to clean up your act. And it's like, wow,
I mean, it was
that is interesting.
incredibly damning findings. And yet, as you say, they continue to operate. So to try to make sense of all this, we thought it would be a great idea to get in Tim Costello. Tim is a Senior Fellow with us at CPX. He's a lead spokesperson for the End COVID for All campaign. He's a very busy person. And he's also someone who's been an extremely vocal critic of gambling for decades, especially poker machines.
Yes, Tim has been protesting Crown ever since the beginning, really, and he's had a front row seat to how its influence has played out over the years. And so we started by asking him, what are his thoughts about the Royal Commission's findings?
The things I started saying about Crown 25 years ago, that there's money laundering going on, there's enabling of organised crime, there's deliberate predatory targeting of particularly people from poorer postcodes with the Crown pokies, the incentives, they were the only pokies you could play endlessly day and night. So the findings was that Crown is completely unfit to hold a licence by the Royal Commissioner for all the words you just read out: illegality, exploitation, disgraceful behaviour. That would kill any other business from operating, and yet it got a 2-year probationary licence with a special manager appointed by the state who can veto the board and veto Crown CEO. Unheard of in Australian history ever for a private company to have a state-appointed special manager with those powers. And if that special manager after 2 years says Crown hasn't reformed, they lose their licence. That was the final result. Very puzzling to all of us.
So it's a very special situation we have here, Tim. But we'll come back to that in a moment. But tell us a bit about your early protests against Crown, the nature of those. You got yourself into a bit of trouble with this, right?
Yes. So early on, I had organised some of my urban seed and other church members to do prayer walks around the temporary Crown Casino. We believed it was a spiritual force. Then when Crown Casino's permanent site was opened and spent at least $20 million on a party, and we're all meant to celebrate this wonderful advent of Crown Casino, I organised the Not the Casino party. And Rachel Griffiths, the actress, came and made a wonderful speech why she's proud to be un-Victorian. She had stripped naked on the red carpet, well, topless, not naked, on the red carpet at the opening of Crown Casino, with her niece holding up a placard, a little girl saying, "Need, not greed." And Rachel said later, "I hope the Reverend Tim Costello wasn't offended with my protest. I've been following what he's doing." So
we're not going to ask you if you were, Tim, or whether you decided to go topless as well.
I averted my eyes. But at the Not the Casino party, we had Archie Roach and my friend the Chocolate.
My friend the Chocolate Cake.
Yeah, and so many musicians supporting us. Jeff Kennett had called me a leftist cleric. I was un-Victorian. He was going very hard after me. So there was a bit of conflict. And
Tim, I remember you were in an interview, a radio interview on this topic, and that didn't go well either.
No. So 3AW, the Neil Mitchell program, had a broadcast studio in the gleaming new Crown Palace. He asked me, as the leading critic, to have a look at Crown, and then started saying, well, I asked you to have a look. It's a fantastic facility, you have to admit, Tim, for Melbourne. And I said, there's so much money and power here. It will buy everyone. It'll buy the media. It'll buy politicians. Mitchell said, you're accusing me of being bought. Nobody buys me. I said, look, there's so much power and money here, Neil, you wouldn't even know if you'd been bought. And he threw me out of the radio studio at that point.
Tim, why were you so opposed to this money-making venture that would lift Victoria out of the economic doldrums, as their Premier, Jeff Kennett, claimed?
I hadn't a personal vendetta against gambling. Funnily enough, my grandfather was an SP bookie, and my father could always pick a winner at the races. He grew up near Flemington. My work as a lawyer and as a Baptist minister in St Kilda, where I started back in the early 80s, a woman walked in just after pokies had been introduced, asking me to represent her. She'd lost $60,000 stealing from her employer because of her addiction to pokies. Some of them at Crown Casino, but she played in various places. I represented her. She got 4 years jail. And I remember visiting her in prison. Her name was Zlata Petrovic, and saying, how does a middle-aged woman, happily married, doesn't smoke or drink, has never been in trouble with the law, end up in jail for 4 years? And the penny dropped. The machines she was playing are built for addiction. They turn legal citizens literally into criminals. So that was my emotional crossing of the line, and I started then to see that the whole politics of the state under Jeff Kennett's gaming-led revolution were organised around Crown. It grew to twice the size of what was allowed in the tender brief. You had to have the Grand Prix in Melbourne in Albert Park next to Crown to fill Crown, its hotel, and the planning decisions, the cultural dominance, all was now being absorbed into Crown. So that's where it all began for me.
Yeah, I really was struck in your piece in the Saturday paper, Tim. You describe Crown as too big and too powerful, and even picking up on the language that we've heard out of the GFC, too big to fail. Can you give us a picture of how critical Crown is to Victoria's coffers? Something like more than 10% of state taxes are raised through pokies, this kind of thing.
Yeah, well, pokies raises $2.2 billion, and that's about 12% of state taxes that the Victorian government can raise. Crown is only $200 million in taxes. It's very small compared to the $2 billion from the pokies in pubs and clubs everywhere else. But Crown has always been able to culturally dominate the city. It's the biggest public building in Australia, twice the size of our federal parliament. It is in the prime site within the city. It then sells itself saying the biggest single site employer, 12,000 employees. Now, that's nonsense. Most of the employees are people who are sub-lessors of Crown. So they're all the restaurants and food chains and
so not directly employed. Yeah.
No, absolutely. They only share a landlord, but Crown has always passed itself off in that way. And yes, too big to fail has become really the reason that Crown still is on probation, that any other business in Victoria, after findings like that, would have had a licence revoked.
I remember you saying as well that the Logies, the Walkley Awards, the Brownlow Medal are all hosted at Crown. So it's quite an intrinsic part of the life of the city, isn't it?
Absolutely. The extraordinary capture of the city of Melbourne. And I'm old enough to remember when pre-Crown, Melbourne took great pride, almost conservative pride, in the MCG, the Victoria Market, the wonderful Victorian streetscapes, suddenly for it to be now dominated by Crown. It's why when the Catholic Archbishop, one Christmas Day, when Jeff Kennett, who, flirted with being a Catholic, I think his wife did briefly, went along to a Christmas Day Mass, and the Catholic Archbishop said, we won't be dominated by the cultural symbols of Crown, Kennett stormed out. Because Kennett couldn't really attack the Catholic Archbishop, he just started attacking me and boxing. Well, the call started on Christmas Day. I was having lunch with my brother, my parents, and Kennett's attacking me again, and it continued for the next week, really. I think that was a really spiritual moment at one level. What is dominant in the culture of Melbourne? And to criticise, as the Catholic Archbishop did, the dominance of Crown, literally led to a political tantrum. So, yeah, its dominance is extraordinary.
You did mention that Crown Casino's footprint is more than twice the size of Parliament House. I found this absolutely shocking. And in your article, you made the case that both Labor and Liberal state premiers have in some ways been captured by these kinds of interests. Can you give us a grab of how that's played out over the last 25 years?
Yes, so Joan Kerner, a Labor Premier, actually gave the licence for Crown because Victoria was broke. The Labor government were in desperate straits. She lost that election and Kennett became the Premier. Kerner later said, the worst decision of my political life, giving Crown a licence. She deeply regretted it. Kennett then led the gaming-led recovery. He said, Victoria is going to have a gaming-led recovery. It was Crown, it was pokies. He became the chief spruiker. And when the temporary casino opened, Kennett being there and saying, this casino is a beacon of hope in Melbourne. It is the new spirit of Melbourne.
Oh, that's frightening.
And hope and spirit are very important words for me. And that electric shock, I remember it, went through my body. He's talking about a casino. Labor were very much a rabble at that point, a very small parliamentary representation. I was being called the de facto leader of the opposition for taking on Kennett.
Yeah.
And Labor MPs would ring me and say, good on your team, when we get elected, we're going to clip Crown's wings. It's shocking. As soon as they got elected in 1999, I was shocked. Those same Labor ministers had their fundraisers for the party almost immediately at Crown, fell into line with Crown, took huge donations from Crown. Both sides of politics have been captured.
This is Life and Faith, and Justine and I are speaking with Tim Costello about gambling, casinos, sports betting and poker machines, which for Tim is the biggest threat of all. What can we learn about ourselves when we step back and look at the place gambling has in our community and our national psyche? Here's Justine to draw out some of this from Tim.
I want to quote you back to yourself. You wrote this in an op-ed earlier this year. You wrote, "No conversation about gambling in Australia begins without a cultural nod that Australians of all backgrounds love a bet. It is in our DNA, supposedly, and this is our cultural myth, as if at birth, unlike other nations, we are baptised in the eucalyptus oil and a punt." I love that. So you go on, 2 flies up a wall, 2 up in the Anzac tradition, a horse race that stops the nation, and so it goes. This is what it means to be Australian. Now, we typically think it's individual people who are vulnerable to gambling addiction, but you seem to be suggesting that gambling has a powerful grip on Australian identity.
Yeah, I think we have bought a false, devastating myth about national identity being identified with gambling. And until I wrote a book back in 2000 called Want to Bet, I believe that too, that Australians, of all people, just love a punt more than others. I discovered the Kiwis, Irish, the Chinese, the English, all boast about being the greatest gamblers on earth. That it's a complete myth that Australia has taken a step further by saying, and we're going to have the greatest number of pokies on earth. 20% of the world's pokies are in Australia. 75% of the world's pokies in clubs and pubs are in Australia. Most pokies are just in casinos. So we have dangerously married a false myth to self-identity, such that if Americans are known by the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, and we look at them and shake our heads, The rest of the world looks at us and shakes their head saying they are totally captured by gambling. It's why we now have 40% higher losses per head. We're number one losses in the world, 40% higher than the country that comes second. That national false myth, destructive myth, has captured us.
Tim, you're very critical about how much gambling is such a part of ordinary life in Australia. We see it all over sports advertising now. It's absolutely everywhere. You can't escape it. What are the spiritual dimensions to this? You mentioned this earlier. It does feel like you seem to think that there's a sort of spiritual darkness attached to this ubiquitous gambling.
Yes, I do. And I think it offers some spiritual false substitutes. That sense that ordinary little nobody me. When I sit in front of a poker machine and the 5 pyramids come up and the lights go off and there's a jackpot, I have been blessed. In fact, I have received grace. Someone up there surprised me and made me feel special. So I think both at a national level, certainly Crown in Melbourne, a city level, the darkness and the hold on the culture, where all the cultural events happen at Crown, where you can't criticise Crown until recently, and at a very personal level, that sense of grace with a win. Secondly, the false substitute of community. Where does a middle-aged woman whose husband falls asleep in front of the fire in the footy go if she wants to dress up, go somewhere safe, or if she's on her own? It's a club. They open the door. They know your name. As you start to play the pokies, they'll bring you a coffee. You think, it's okay to go there on my own because so many others are on their own. It doesn't feel awkward. And there's community. So much so that green spaces where new suburbs are going up, the first thing state governments now do is license a pokies club to get community on the cheap. Gambling has now claimed it is the giver of community.
And this is a pretty grim form of community, Tim.
Well, it's a community built on predatory behaviour. We often hear gamble responsibly as if it's an individual, a pathetic individual. No, it's the machine. We know this machine is built for addiction. So community brought to you by the addiction from pokies machines is very grim.
Can there not be some community, like get a bunch of my mates, go to the horse races? It can be a bit of fun, right?
Yeah, so we certainly know in Victoria when we got pokies in 1992 that you could do damage with horse racing, but with horse racing you at least knew the odds. You knew if it was 30 to 1 you were going to blow your money. You don't know it at all with pokies. Secondly, before pokies, women constituted in Victoria less than 7% of problem gamblers. After the introduction of pokies, women are now 53% of problem gamblers. And it's still women who, by and large, pay the rent, do the shopping, manage the finances. This is why the ripple effect is so devastating with so many women becoming addicted by pokies. With that community safety feel, they didn't go to horse racing and TABs before.
Tim, you mentioned the lady that you defended. Did she fit into that story you've just painted of women kind of drawn to certain forms of community and the money's going in that direction to the pokies rather than other things?
Yes, she did. I mean, Zlata's marriage survived and she's got 2 lovely daughters and a son. So she wasn't totally alone, but when pokies got introduced without consumer warnings in 1992, everyone just thought they're harmless. They're like bingo, which you can't really get addicted to, or lotto. Her story, I don't remember if it was for social reasons she went to the club, but it's a very common story. That moment, when you have your first win, you feel so special. She just felt so special. You never actually remember your losses, but that win, an early win, is always a very common refrain down the path of addiction.
And it strikes me that when you mention grace, right? Like it's a very distorted form of grace. When you win at the pokies, you feel that you're special, that something in the universe or someone in the universe has kind of blessed you. And also what you were saying about community, there's a real distortion, isn't there, of what I guess people of faith would say are some of the huge benefits of religion, but they're being deployed in this way and distorted in this context with pokies and that promise of a win, promise of feeling connected to something bigger than yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, all of us live out of a story. The Christian story that I indwell is that God's grace comes to me without the expectation that I've got to earn it, that I've got to play a game, and community comes to me as belonging and gift. The story of the national myth of Australians love a punt, and if you're going to find community, it'll be down at the local pub or club with pokies, and you'll experience some grace down there, is an alternative story. I think a false story.
Yeah, and a bit of an empty story. But Tim, how do you resist the call of being a bit of a wowser, moral police? Come on, typical that Christians want to stop people having fun.
And you have been called this, haven't you, Tim?
I have, yeah.
And worse.
I like the fact that someone way back at the turn of the century, wowser stands for we only want social evils remedied. And I thought, well, if that's what it means, I'm happy to be a wowser. Everyone should be. As I said earlier, I didn't come to gambling with a moral Christian view. I wasn't a gambler, but I didn't oppose even pokies coming into Victoria when it happened. It wasn't an issue for me until I met Zlata and saw the damage and addiction. For me, it's more a social justice issue. I realised very early on that most of the pokies were in the poorest postcodes. They certainly weren't in Toorak and Malvern. And it was transferring money from the poorest into the pockets of the captains of industry who lived in the rich suburbs, and that this was just profoundly unjust. That's the motivation rather than a moral horror at gambling.
And I wanted to ask as well, is there something that's uniquely harmful about gambling? We don't seem to have the same attitude to alcohol. You mentioned the machines are so addictive, the pokies are so addictive. Is that what makes gambling so destructive? Or is there something about gambling that is particularly a problem?
Yeah, it depends which form of gambling you're talking about. So people don't really get addicted or do damage with lotto or raffles or bingo or a whole heap of, at times, recreational gambling. Look, the pokies, in Australia, 24 billion's lost each year, 15 billion comes from pokies. Pokies, we now know, when you sit in front of them, the lights going off and the sounds release dopamine from the brain that hits the pleasure centre of the brain with the force of cocaine. They are built for addiction. So that form of gambling is profoundly dangerous. I have a drink. I know I can drink too much, but I also know one glass of red wine can be okay for me. A flutter and gambling, that can be okay, but it's less than 25% of the population that ever play the pokies. Yet over 50% of the revenue coming from pokies is coming from addicted people, according to the Productivity Commission. They are so profoundly addictive. That's the difference, I think.
Tim, when you think back to the birth of Crown Casino in Melbourne, that brought one kind of culture to the scene. If we could go back, I wonder what might have been a better option for Melbourne, do you think?
Well, we had the option, Simon. That site was to be the Melbourne Museum. And one of the first acts of Jeff Kennett was to kick the Melbourne Museum up to Carlton, where nobody can find it. By the way, it's a magnificent museum when you do find it. Mm-hmm. And put a casino, the biggest public building in Australia, on that site.
Yeah, and all the things that can go with that. So there could be, you can imagine, art galleries and music and just the whole culture that brings to a city. Does feel like a missed opportunity.
Yeah, no, it really reoriented the whole city in terms of what it stands for, who's expendable in this city. It was shocking. You know, the Melbourne Museum is a magnificent space with coffee shops and galleries and music. If that was at South Bank, that would have been consistent with the Melbourne I love.
Tim, I'm a bit of a distant observer, but I hear a lot of clubs will often trumpet their credentials by saying, oh, we pour all these profits back into the community. I have a feeling you don't buy that, or you're going to complicate that easy story.
Yeah, that's the biggest rort going on, Justine. The money that clubs say they're putting back in is a tax that shouldn't ever be allowed to be branded by the club. Government should say this is our tax and we're distributing it to community groups on an impartial basis. One, it's very low, it's very minimal. Club CEOs, by the way, are on $500,000 to $750,000, far more than the Prime Minister. And for them to take what is a state government tax and dole it out to community groups, and often by their support and silence, is a complete rort.
There's no one else lining up to give the footy jerseys for your footy club, whereas sometimes with the advertising and stuff, they will do that. That's a problem that we get into these positions where we're reliant on this kind of revenue.
Well, the state government could actually buy the footy jerseys for the clubs. It's a tax the clubs have to pay, and they just say, look, we gave it here, here and here. Right. Western Australia, by the way, which has no pokies outside Burswood Casino, has stronger clubs, higher levels of sport and recreation, high levels of participation than the East Coast with all the pokies and clubs. So, they've really bored us.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Justine Toe. Thanks to Tim Costello, the leftist cleric, as Jeff Kennett famously labelled him. Thanks to Tim for all that he does working on behalf of vulnerable people.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode and hope that you will send it along to a friend or two. We've been doing this survey asking you, our loyal listeners, what you think about life and faith and how we can make it better. And plenty of you have said in the responses we've received so far that you don't tend to send it on to others. Well, we are sure that there is something in this episode that you think someone else can benefit from. So maybe we would like you to really consider sending it along to someone and also leaving us a rating or review. And also do look out for that survey. It's posted in the show notes as well as on social media. We want you to give us some feedback on how you think life and faith is going and what we might do for the next year. Please check that out.
Next week.
Desire is a basic human yearning. We see desire in the newborn baby for physical and psychological needs. We see desire in the dying person, even if they've lost the capacity for speech. Desire is always there from the moment of birth to the last gasp of our breath.